Hello,
All right.
Jen.
Hi.
How are you? So
I'm
we had some
doing
technical
okay.
difficulties to get this thing started, and as I was telling you, it's 2021. We're still, you know, trying to struggle with conferencing uh, software. Although I think things have gotten better as far as conferencing software after the COVID, pandemic. I think we have seen some improvements. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it definitely forced a lot of changes, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So, in a good way, it accelerated a lot of things. Although I suspect it will continue to be a challenge just because presentation software and, remote recording software just continues to be a challenge.
It's a tough problem to solve. So, well, thank you for making the time, Jen. I appreciate it. Um,
Yeah.
Jen from Dante 32.
Yes. Yes.
So
And happy to join you.
thank you so much. Uh, so before we get into who you are, you're a very interesting person. So we want to find out who you are and what you do. What's up with the name Dante 32? Where did it come from?
um, it's kind of an interesting and not all that interesting story, I suppose. It's a combination from the uh, co-founder that started the business with me. Dante was a name that he had always liked and thought he might use as one of his kids' names, and didn't end up happening that way. And 32 came from me, so um, I thought about starting a business for probably a decade before I actually did, and so had toyed around with different names and ended up with landing on something at 32 in it. Um, and the significance for me is personal. One of my brothers actually passed away when he was 32, and he
Oh,
was an older sibling. And so I realized when I turned 32, which just happened to be when I was thinking about business names, this was a while back, um, that, it was like all this time basically getting to live all the years he wouldn't have
hmm.
seen. So I know that sounds a little uh, it came from a good place, actually. It was sort of an inspiring thing.
Yeah.
He and I had always talked about starting a business together, so that just felt
Oh,
like a way to kind of a nod in that
yeah.
direction. So,
That's pretty. That's a meaningful name that you have,
yeah.
and I like it.
So.
I like. It sounds good. Sounds cool and hip. By the way.
It's definitely one of those that feels very like, you know, I don't know, businesses come up with names that you're like, where? I have
Yeah.
no idea. Maybe they just needed a domain that was available.
True. Like Google was a
Right.
misspelled word, right?
Yeah.
They ended up with it. Yeah, and Dante has this literary thing, right? Dante is eternal and all that.
Yeah, and even 32 actually has a lot of, there's even some kind of tech components to it as well. So there's a lot of different directions to go to
Yeah,
with that.
yeah. And let's see how many syllables. Dante 32. So that's 5 syllables,
Hmm.
which is great for speech, by the way.
Oh,
You
yeah?
know? Oh, yeah. The more syllables, the better.
Okay.
So when we were thinking about the name of our company,
Hmm.
so one of the requirements, there were several requirements. One of them is if I type that name, I don't want anything to show it. That's number one.
Mm.
Number
Hmm.
two, it needs to be at least 2 to 3 syllables, right? So with lingo is 3 syllables, right? And so this is a piece of advice I give folks who want to start a company. First, it has to be easy to remember and all that. Now, but it needs to be more than 1 syllable. If it's 1 syllable, it's not going to perform very well
Hmm.
in speech, right?
What is it, just make it more memorable, or what is the additional syllables? Like, what's the
Well, the
benefit there?
software itself needs as much signals, right? So if you say
Mm.
if your name is Dante,
Hmm.
Dante is 1 syllable, right? So it doesn't have enough signal to map it to the Dante. But
I
Dante
see.
32, it's a lot of signal, right?
Gotcha.
And so the recognition, it's not
More
going to say, what did you
points.
say? Yeah, it's for, exactly, right? So the more syllables, the better, but not too many, of course, right?
Sure.
So yeah, so wanted to start with your name because I always liked it. And then when did you guys launch the company?
Right about 3 years ago. So it was mid 2018. So June of 2018. So yeah, three years.
Nice. And what's interesting is I think you have your target client is is well defined, right? Is it the enterprise? Is it folks who are serious about launching podcasts in a professional way? Maybe you can define the client.
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's specifically looking at businesses and brands who are looking at creating a podcast as an additional marketing channel, effectively.
Mm-hmm.
So people have blogs and a website, and deliver content in a number of ways, and are looking to do that in an audio form. And really, the differentiation there is it's kind of as opposed to people who are looking to start a podcast either as a form of entertainment or kind of like nonfiction, or really to make the podcast itself the primary business. Typically, that aren't the types of shows that we work with. Instead, it's businesses that have revenue that's independent of the podcast and are using the podcast again as kind of marketing for that original business, rather than trying to make the podcast a business in and of itself. And there's a handful of reasons for that, but part of it was a recognition that, frankly, the that space of the market wasn't really being served, and it's a lot more now than it was 3 years ago. And the other is that, frankly, the dynamics are changing, and the ability to start a podcast from scratch and make that a primary business has gotten a lot harder, and will continue probably to get harder just as time goes on.
Yeah, yeah. And so, when you engage with a business, I guess there must be different reasons why a business should launch a podcast. So how would you convince someone who doesn't have a podcast? They're a business, they have clients, they have a brand. How do you go about convincing them that they should have a podcast if you sincerely believe that they should have a podcast?
It's an interesting question, right? It comes down a little bit to the idea of what's the right audience to attract. And to be honest, I'm not entirely sure I would go about trying to convince someone that they should do a podcast if they weren't already kind of leaning in that direction, in part because it takes a little bit of commitment. But to dig into, I guess, a little bit of what the underside of that is why someone should even think about it, is I think it's on one hand, it's really having an awareness of where things are going. So obviously there's a lot that's moving in the sound and audio space. It's something we've certainly talked about and you're aware of. And so from a industry trend and, again, kind of consumer expectation, I think more and more there is the expectation that businesses have a presence, whether it's in podcasting or some form of audio. And so it makes sense as a business to go ahead and invest in that. And I think that podcasting, certainly you can have some like really early success, but a lot of it is a little bit of a slow burn. It takes a while to build that as a channel. And so it's good to get started. And that way, when someone comes and they want to learn about your business, they can see that you have a podcast and check out some old episodes. And I think that, I would certainly I can't think of an instance in which I would say, hey, you should do a podcast instead of a blog or instead of some other form of marketing. I really think it's a complement and an additional channel. And it allows you to get your voice and your message out to your audience in a variety of places, because you want to be able to meet people where they are. And some people, are on YouTube or Instagram. They prefer to read, and they're going to love to get your newsletter. Other folks are on the go, and being able to listen to a podcast and learn something about you or your business, or kind of the topic area you are operating in, I think is helpful.
Makes sense, yeah. So, if do you think excuse me, do you think that that for big brands, getting to a point where a podcast is like a must-have, just like a Facebook page is a must-have. And if you don't have it, so if you don't have it, then that's a red flag. Are we getting close to that, or still ways off?
I think we are a little bit, actually.
Hmm.
You know, there will always be, kind of the long tail on all of those trends. And I certainly don't think we're at the point where it's kind of an evolution, right? And I think that you can look at a lot of different podcasting in many ways follows the same path. If you look at, having a website and then it's like having a blog. If you look at, kind of how video goes, these days, for most kinds of businesses, if they don't have a website, they don't have a presence, there's a very narrow, I think, niche of mostly like your local dry cleaner, maybe, that you wouldn't necessarily have that expectation. But even there,
I
most
think
people
everybody,
expect you to have a website.
or at
I
least
don't,
a Facebook page. It looks like everybody has, even those who don't have
sure.
website. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, somewhere on the web, right? Like that I can
Somewhere.
find you. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't think that podcasting is that yet. Like, it's number one. But I would say it's certainly close to the idea of like you have a blog or a newsletter or some kind of content that you're putting out.
Hmm.
I think increasingly the expectation is that there's
Yeah.
some kind of audio presence.
Do you think right now where we are, it's a differentiator? Like, okay, look at me. I have a podcast. My competition doesn't have a podcast, or not?
Yes, actually. So I
Okay.
think that's kind of where we're at. It's growing. And again, when we started this business 3 years ago, even the term branded podcast was newer.
Hmm.
We really, talked about it as audio first content marketing. So kind of, again, tying it into some
Oh,
existing
say that again. Audio
concepts.
first.
Yeah, audio first content marketing.
Really? Okay. Well,
Because
so
people
that's
were familiar with content marketing at that point,
yeah.
but using podcasting in that way was a newer idea.
Right. So the audio first is was that is that now a standard term within, I don't know, where within the marketing, content marketing, or your world?
I don't know that it necessarily is. That was something that, again, I think it's kind of moving in that direction.
Yeah.
But perhaps to backtrack a little bit on what I was saying, I
Hmm.
think that we are headed in a direction where the consumer expectation is that you have a podcast in the way that you have social channels and everything else. We aren't certainly there
Yeah.
in terms of ubiquity yet, because there's lots of businesses that don't have a podcast,
Which
and
is
there's
great for
many
you,
reasons
right?
for that. Yeah, yeah. Um,
Yeah.
and I think in that way it is a bit of a differentiator.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we've talked about, we have some clients who specifically, they had competitors who had a podcast, and it's kind of like, okay, your target audience is, they could listen to you if you want to create that content, or they're going to be listening to your competitors.
Yeah.
And so that is certainly an argument, and I think can be a differentiator.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess it's within the digital marketing team that you have these conversations, right? About
Hmm.
the podcast, right? And what makes a good brand? What makes a good branded podcast?
This is always a fun question. One of the things I really love about the medium and the space is also one of the biggest challenges. It's like all good things in life, I suppose. Double-edged swords is it's incredibly flexible. So a lot of people still think, which is interesting because YouTube is probably the same way, but I think because I'm going to bounce around here, so let me run with this for a second. I think a lot of people think radio as sort of the roots of podcasting, and you can certainly think that it makes a lot of sense, like talk radio to podcasting moving forward, and that's true. However, I think coming from that mental model gets locked into kind of this traditional broadcasting idea where you have time slots and 30-second ad spots, and you have to run this long and put it out daily, whatever it is, like all of those preconceived ideas of how like a radio show would go. And the reality is podcasting can kind of be anything. It's really digital audio delivered in an RSS feed. And so I think what's exciting and interesting, and I will come back around to kind of like what makes a good branded podcast, but I think the potential is there to do some really creative things. And that's one of the things I'm looking forward to doing more of, and exploring what the possibilities are for the medium. And so I think what makes a good branded podcast is thinking through, what is this medium best for? You know, it is possible, and there's perhaps this makes sense for your brand, is you have written content and you want to effectively do an audio version of that, and you're going to put that out as a podcast. And that there's a place in which that makes a lot of sense. If you have a really successful newsletter, in fact, I follow some newsletters that do this, that started putting their newsletter out as a podcast, which I love, because I have a backlog email, list of newsletters that I don't have time to read, but I can listen, while I'm walking into work. So that makes a ton of sense. But maybe that doesn't make the best sense for your audience. So I think, as with any marketing effort, business effort, it comes down to being thoughtful about why you're doing the thing. So knowing your audience, knowing what your marketing message is, how are you best positioned, and then pairing that with this medium of audio and saying, what's the kind of content that we can create thoughtfully that matches those two things up.
Yeah. So you mentioned something really interesting there, which is the history of radio, right? Because it's on the airwaves, and so time, you have bandwidth, and people have to listen synchronously, and so on, right? So there's a lot of artificial, so to speak, impositions that are being put. Like, why does it have to be 60 minutes every time, or 30 minutes every time? Why can't it be more or less, and people can listen to any time? And why does it have to be all at once? Can it be like, chunks whenever, right? I don't know. It feels like the medium itself needs to break away from its roots, so to speak, that are artificial, right? The radio had its constraints, and constraints are no longer there, and we're still living within those constraints. And I think innovation happens when somebody says, "Wait a minute, why am I still doing this? I don't need to do this, right?"
Right.
And I can do it in different ways. So, what do you have a couple of ideas about how things could just break away a little bit from a traditional? Once a week, 30 minutes, you have the host and they talk, and there's a topic,
right,
and it ends, and you go to the next episode, and there's a guest,
right. So I will start out by, I'm realizing I rarely answer things in a straightforward way. It probably says a lot about
you're
me.
giving me you always give me the answer, but you mention things that are interesting, which allows me to ask the next question.
Right.
Which is great.
So I was going to say, I think that because I don't want people to get intimidated by the idea that you have to come up with something totally out of the box and creative and everything else. At the end of the day, we work with a lot of folks that have what is now kind of a standard, certainly in branded podcasts, but all kinds of podcasts, like interview format, very much like this, and delivered on a, every other week kind of basis. And I think that is a very solid way to start. Consistency is key with all things, certainly with podcasting. And so finding something that you feel like you can execute on a continuous basis and then grow from. Because that's another area about podcasting, is it's not just the flexibility of the medium, it's also that you can change, you can reformat your show. You can, think that you're going to do it continuously and then be like, you know what, it's going to be seasonal. We're going to take a break. We're going to come back with a second season, and you can format it differently. Like, there's lots of options. So getting started and getting moving, I think, is important. And if that means launching an interview-based show, like, go for it. To your point about, like, thinking outside of that box or different ways to do it. This is a, it's an example that's been around for a while and been written up actually in lots of articles. The name of the company, of course, right now is eluding me, but it's like a toothpaste or toothbrush company, and they do like Zen minutes. It's like a 2-minute podcast. It's the length of time you're supposed to be brushing your teeth. And so they're literally 2-minute episodes. And I think that's something that makes a ton of sense if you're, again, selling toothbrushes, and kind of a creative way of thinking about delivering the content. And that's something that also, one way perhaps to step out of that radio box is to recognize that at the end of the day, it's really just digital audio. And even podcasting, and there's lots of different opinions about this in the podcast space, but there's debates about if it's not over an RSS feed, is it still a podcast? And you've got Apple coming out with finally kind of getting more involved and coming out with subscription services and more like exclusive content in different channels. So even that idea of like, what is a podcast is breaking away a little bit. And so I think it's recognizing that you can record your message as voice, as audio, and then deliver that in a whole assortment of ways, which, yes, in an RSS feed through all of the podcast players makes a lot of sense. You should also have that on your website. There's lots of ways to repurpose content that starts out as a podcast into other areas. And that's definitely something we recommend, especially for businesses, because, time is really limited. So the more coverage and bandwidth you can kind of get out of that one-time content effort, I think is always helpful.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. So do you think we will continue to consume these this audio content, whether it's podcasts or all these creative forms, in our smartphone, or do you think this smart speaker is going to have a dent in terms of the share? Because right now, really, the share is, even myself, who's a fan of smart speakers, I just like to listen to it on my phone. Sometimes I do a Bluetooth to the speaker, but I sort of not really using the smart speaker. And using the smart speaker would say, Alexa, launch the podcast name, or play the podcast name, right? You see that. And usually it gets it, right? But people are not using it that way. Do you think that's going to change? I think the earbuds, perhaps. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have to say, there was a lot of talk even 3 years ago around the increase in smart speakers and that kind of having an influence. I think what has played out, and I don't have the latest kind of Edison stats off the top of my head, but if I recall correctly, even the most recent reports, like share of ear for smart speakers when it comes to podcasts is still pretty low, and hasn't moved a ton. And I think, I don't know, it'll be interesting to see how that goes. I have some thoughts maybe about why that's less so. And I also don't know how much it matters, because I do think that there is a little bit of a halo effect, and it's one of the things, as a business, we're really looking at audio and voice holistically as a space. And I think that those things kind of work in tandem. It's like you're seeing a lot more voice interactions with different applications and devices, and that may never have like a direct overlap with podcasting per se. However, like collectively, those things are all connected, and I think it's it helps all of us when there are increases in those areas. So as far as people listening to podcasts via voice speaker, I think it will correspond perhaps, and you'll have more of an increase when people are listening to podcasts with other people, which is still kind of a yet to be seen whether or not that will happen, because one of the reasons I think podcasts got really popular and frankly, why marketers jumped in and really loved it is it's the intimacy of the medium, and it's, you'll always hear, and I say it, it's like they're in your ears.
Hmm.
And so it's something that you do, that you're not listening in a group, where it's like if you had your smart speaker and you live with other people, then everybody's listening to the podcast. And I think that, yeah, if you, that's one of the reasons, even I live by myself, but I will listen to podcasts with my headphones on, carrying my iPhone around in my pocket. So it's just interesting how the kind of user patterns, I think, evolve.
Do you think talk radio, talk radio AM, which is mainly conservative and all that, do you think that had an influence in terms of creating this culture of listening, or is that just has always been there? I never thought about that until now, actually. So I don't even have any thoughts.
Yeah. Well, I think that it's funny because like podcasting seems to be having a moment in the last 5 or so years, but is a 15, if I'm doing my math right, plus year old industry in space. And so again, it was like a really slow, it's a little bit like the industry moved the way that kind of you could expect your own podcast maybe to grow, is it was a slow burn for a really long time. And I think had, for a number of reasons, it was hard to find, there's still too much friction maybe in listening and discovering podcasts than there should be, but there certainly used to be. And so you had to have enough kind of technical know-how, I think, to get into it. And a lot of people, kind of early podcasts, again, kind of came out of that space of thinking about like independent radio and talk radio. And so there's just a lot of that that's kind of embedded. And, I think most folks in the industry would probably point to Serial as one of the big things that had a giant spike in popularity and mainstream awareness of what a podcast even is. Yeah. And it's continued, since then. So I think we've moved away from talk radio in a lot of ways, and I think it's good.
Yeah, no, it's good. Sure. I think NPR had like This American Life. I used to listen to them. I never thought of them as podcasts as such. I thought they were initially just regular shows as such. But they had the feel of a podcast, right? There was a music background, and it was like it had a feel for it and all, right? And then it turned. So maybe all that was part of the beginnings of. And then you had Serial that came in, sort of just a stamp of we are here. The podcasting medium is here. Why don't we take a small break, and then we'll come back with part number 2.
Sounds good.